Welcome to tonight's webinar. So my name's Beth Wood and I'm one of the 3 directors of Mind Fitness Training. And Mind Fitness works in organisations throughout the UK, and then we also work with individuals in public sessions and events and coaching. And then we have teams of actors and practitioners working in schools. We have 3 projects in schools that are funded by children in need. And tonight's webinar is resilience for mental health, well-being and performance. And they're actually the 3 strands of the Mind Fitness program. And these are our directors. So we have 3 directors. And Bri, who's on the left, heads up the performance or personal effectiveness side of the program. Andy, there on the right, heads up the mental health side of the program. And I head up the well-being or cognitive training. But actually everything that we do across all 3 strands is seen through the lens of neuroscience and delivered through the medium of creative learning. And we do that because we have really good evidence now that if we can build neural pathways between our higher thinking brain, that's our prefrontal cortex, and our neocortex, which is the home of most of our imagination, then it's really good for positive mental health. So we use creativity and creative thinking a lot in everything that we do. We also have a marketing team, and this is Irem on the left and Erin on the right, and they're absolutely brilliant. We have a book, which is Unlock You, and we're very grateful. So that was published last year by Pearson, and this August and September, it was Business Book of the Month at WH Smith, which is fantastic. And then very, very dear to my heart, we have Tembo. So Tembo is an app that we released right at the beginning of lockdown. It's a free app. It's still very much in the beta stage. Everyone that joins now is an early adopter, certainly. But there's already hundreds of exercises on there. Everything's free, and it would be brilliant if as many people as possible could sign up for Tembo. And I'm going to actually go back to it sort of near the end of the session and show you the slide when we finish so that you know exactly how to get it. So in terms of the sort of practical for this, it lasts for just under an hour and it will finish with a Q&A. If you have any questions for me, please could you leave them in the chat function rather than the Q&A, so that I've only got one place to look when we get to the end. And if you'd like me to reply to you personally afterwards, that's absolutely fine, but please could you just mark it clearly in the chat, or you can email me after the session, because on the contact slide at the end will be my email. So please do feel free to do that if you'd like me to reply personally to you. So if you haven't already, it'd be brilliant if you could get a pen and paper. Lovely. And we'll head into thinking about resilience. So when I was young, I was a very serious ice skater. And when I was about 12, I changed coach. And my new coach kept telling me that I wasn't resilient enough to make it to the top, that I wasn't hard enough to take the knocks. And, you know, I knew then, even then, that what he was trying to do was to toughen me up. I didn't seem to be able to have that kind of hard outer coating that other people did. So I determined to think of resilience like a skin or a coat that I could put on whenever I needed to. And I got pretty good at it, and I could let the arrows then just bounce off me. But I knew even then that when I had that on, I wasn't able to connect properly with anybody. And then when I was 17, I hung up the coat for good, gave up skating and went back to college. So I now know that that was kind of old style resilience, that what my trainer was trying to do was to toughen me up. But I knew even then that not only did it mean that you couldn't connect well with people, but it meant that you weren't able to be responsive, and you certainly weren't able to embrace change and allow that to make you strong. So old style resilience still exists in a few of the organisations that Andy and I go to train in, but it's few and far between now. There's a few team managers who will still want their teams to man up and get on with it. But the new style of resilience, which is firmly embraced by the mental health community, is much more about flexibility and is about connecting with the external world. So the techniques that I'll give you tonight, definitely aren't the armor plating clothing that you're going to be putting on, but it's much more about developing a deep-rooted confidence that's at the very heart of resilience. And it's linked very firmly to acceptance. And as I said, to living a more compassionate and connected life. So what I'm going to do now is just put a slide up that gives a few of the words that we've been given when we've been doing some of our trainings. That's words or phrases that sum up resilience. So I'm going to read them out to you. And as I read them, I just want you to think about which ones resonate with you. Or perhaps you've got other words that you would like to jot down of what you think resilience is. So endurance, bravery or courage, resolve, perseverance, determination, spirit, grit, bouncing back, something we get told a lot, rebounding, almost the same thing, and then at the bottom, flexibility. So just have a moment to think about which of those resonate with you, in what you think resilience is, and perhaps in what areas you think you're good at, or perhaps not so good at, to give us a sort of starting point. So as I said, we're going to go through resilience for mental health, then well-being, and then performance. So starting in now, looking at resilience for better mental health. So in terms of mental health, we quite often ask people to give a definition of what resilience is, and people will often tell us that it's being able to cope with stress or being able to cope with stressful situations. So let's think for a second about what stress is. We actually use a definition by Professor Stephen Palmer, and that stress occurs when perceived pressure exceeds your perceived ability to cope. So just have a think about that word perceived for a moment. It's a very important one actually throughout the whole of this session. So Professor Stephen Palmer is probably the leading stress consultant in the country, and he's the person that actually trained Andy. So thinking about the science for a moment, what causes stress? So if we went in through our ears and our eyes into our brain, two pieces, one either side, the amygdala. You may have heard of the amygdala. So the amygdala has two basic jobs to do. In normal times, what it does is it sends information up to the prefrontal cortex, the higher thinking brain. But in terms of when you're in a dangerous situation or a stressful situation, or you have a perceived threat, then what it does instead is it instigates your fight or flight response. I expect people are aware of what that is. So you get flooded with adrenaline and other chemicals that would allow you to fight a wildebeest if it was hurtling towards you, or to flee, to run away, probably faster than you've ever run before if you needed to. So in an evolutionary sense, it's brilliant, it's kept us safe. But what's really important is that once the amygdala kicks in your fight or flight, no information gets sent up to your higher thinking brain. So that means in modern life, when most of our stressful situations mean that we need to be thinking our best think, we simply can't. No good decision-making, problem solving. So it's really key that we have techniques that can get us out of fight or flight as quickly as we can and getting us back to a place when we are thinking our best think. And I'll be talking about some of those techniques as we go through today. In terms of stress, though, it's probably true to say that almost everybody is reporting a higher level of stress since lockdown and the changes that we're having to be coping with. Being overwhelmed is something that we get told a lot in our training, and it's really not a surprise. You know, we are creatures of habit. We'll come back to that later. And we've had so much change thrown at us over a very short period of time. So the way that people have reacted to the stress varies a lot. For some people, it's been sort of incremental, going up steadily, boiling frog syndrome. For others, it seemed very contained. People were doing really well, and then a massive explosion, either of anger or of anxiety. For others, it's been a bit like a roller coaster. Whatever way that stress is and has been affecting you, I would say that using the stress container is a really good technique. We'll have a look at it in a second, because it allows you to regain some measure of control. So the stress container is, of course, metaphorical. We don't really have a stress container inside ourselves, but it's a really simple device that's very effective to think about. So at the top is where all your stressors are coming in. And it would be really great if you draw just a quick diagram of this now, and then at the end of the session, spend some time really thinking in detail about what those stressors are that are coming in down into your stress container. At the bottom, you've got the tap. So that's a way for you to let out the stress. So that's by using your healthy coping mechanisms. So that's all of the techniques that we'll be using today, but it's also connecting with people that you love. It's being creative, as we've said. It's good nutrition, it's exercise, it's good sleep, a whole host of healthy coping mechanisms. And I would say the key in terms of resilience is that resilient people are aware of the state of their stress container pretty much all the time. I'd also say that the whole of the Mind Fitness program is designed to enlarge that stress container. And what that does is it just means you've got a little bit of contingency space. So if the unexpected does happen, as it did in March and has continued to do pretty much ever since, then you've got a little bit of time. It buys you that little bit of time so that you can then step up the amount of healthy coping mechanisms, step up the opening of the tap at the bottom, but you've got a little bit of extra time before it overflows. So definitely working through the Mind Fitness program to do that is really great. One of the techniques that we use all the time, both to reduce the amount of stress in the stress container and also to get yourself out of fight or flight, is mindfulness. It's a really important part of the Mind Fitness program. So we have a very simple definition, which is mindfulness is bringing your attention to the present moment in order to experience life more clearly and more fully. I'm sure quite a lot of you have done some mindfulness practice. It's become so much more common, even over the last few months. So any mindfulness exercise will suspend you in a timeless reality and allow you to step away from the anxiety or the chaos that you're experiencing. But I would say the exercise that I'm going to do with you tonight is a really good example of that. And it's even a good example in the way that it came into existence. It was actually invented by President Truman in the Second World War. And a lot of people said to him, how is it that you're not stressed in such a difficult situation? And he said, it's all right, I have a foxhole in my mind. So he meant a space that he could step into and step away from the stress that he was actually experiencing. So foxhole on my mind is a really lovely mindfulness exercise that I'm going to do with you now. So just get yourself to a position where you're comfortable. Sitting is fine. Great if you can get your feet flat on the floor. Arms to wherever you're comfortable, and if you haven't already, then just close your eyes. And I'd like you to imagine, so this is one of our exercises that uses creative thought. I'd like you to imagine a place that is both safe and beautiful. So mine is an underwater Egyptian city, but it can be anything that you want it to be. It can be a real place that you know, or somewhere from a book or a film or a game, or somewhere completely made up. So just spend a minute creating your foxhole. Think about the detail, the shapes, the textures, the smells, the sounds. And when you've created it with enough detail, I would like you to imagine that you're moving through it, responding as you would to that safe and beautiful place. I'm going to give you about another 10 or so seconds in your foxhole. And then in your own time, just opening your eyes and bringing yourself back to the present moment. So foxhole is a brilliant exercise. Quite a lot of practitioners do it with a trigger in and a trigger out, just so that you know very quickly that you're out of the stressful situation and into the foxhole. So mine is 2 taps of the right hand on the left shoulder, but I know people that do clicks or claps, raised eyebrow so that it can't be seen in meetings, whatever works for you. And the more often you do it, the better. So we'll talk later about adaptive thinking and how it's important to change everything as often as you can. But I would say with this, it's great to have one go-to mindfulness exercise, say Foxhole or any of the others that you can find in our book or on Use Tembo, just because that will become your route of least resistance. We'll come to neuroplasticity and neural pathways a little bit later. But once your brain has that, then you'll go to it very quickly. So for example, I've done it so many times that I barely have to move my hand and I'm already in the foxhole, which is really brilliant. It's a very quick working exercise, even then. So mindfulness will lessen the stresses in your stress container. It will get you out of fight or flight. And it's also a great way to reduce the noise that we have in our mind. So we actually have about 60,000 thoughts a day, and only 5% of those are spent on the task in hand, which is pretty extraordinary. And the rest is noise. So that's made up of a lot of different kinds of noise. For example, there's past noise, where we keep replaying situations even though we can't change them. There's future noise, where we create little mental movies of potential futures, often heading towards a worst case scenario. There's negative self-talk, where we tell ourselves that we can't rather than tell ourselves that we can, and probably very harsh and criticize ourselves. Whichever of those you're falling into the trap of, it's likely that you're going into a spiral of automatic negative thoughts, where one automatic negative thought leads to the next, and before you know it, you're down the rabbit hole, you've lost 10 minutes, and you're feeling really bad. So mindfulness will stop that. As soon as you can feel that you've moved into a place where the automatic negative thoughts have started, just do a really quick exercise to stop them. So Andy and I call the automatic negative thoughts the ants. And definitely resilient people don't let the ants steal their brain. So very important. And the last thing I sort of want to say along the same lines is about the importance of acceptance. Definitely resilient people really know what is and what isn't within their control. So, and it's such an important thing to be able to identify. If something isn't within our control, we have to accept it. We might not approve of it, but we have to accept it. And that will really, really help towards resilience. So we're moving into the second bit now, which is resilience for well-being. So as I said, in Mind Fitness, most of our well-being approaches are based around cognitive training. So that's making the most of our brain, rewiring our brain, which isn't nearly so difficult as it sounds. So we work, as I said, through the lens of neuroscience. So it's all about understanding how the brain works and then optimizing the way it functions in order to achieve whatever it is that we're working on, in this case, to be more resilient. So again, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the science. So scientists used to believe that our brains were set from the time that we went into adulthood. But now we know that the brain stays malleable or plastic, hence the word neuroplasticity, throughout the whole of our lives, which is Wonderful. So that means we can always change the way we think. We basically have billions of neurons, nerve cells, and they connect and they form pathways. That's our neural pathways. Whenever we think something new, we form a new neural pathway. And what's important to remember is that whatever we think about the most will become our strongest and our most robust neural pathway. And the brain will always use that as the default. That becomes your route of least resistance. So as I was saying earlier, if you do an exercise constantly like foxhole, then that will become a very robust neural pathways. Your brain will use it as a default, which is excellent. So that means that we can change the way we think, but we do it by making spindly pathways of new thinking into robust pathways where they become the default position, the route of least resistance. And for most people, that would take about 6 weeks. So it means persevering with whatever it is that you're changing, anything from diet to exercise to sleeping patterns to thinking patterns, whatever it is. It means you absolutely can do it, but you need to persist and practice for about 6 weeks. We can, however, speed that process up by using something called adaptive behavior. So adaptive behavior is adopting a practice of small but continual change. So as I said at the beginning, we're creatures of habit. You know, most of us tie our shoelaces left and then right. We'll put the tea in and then the milk, or the milk and then the tea. And the one that we often say to people in our trainings is, you know, there are probably roads close to where you live that you've never traveled. So we can change that. Neuroplasticity means we can change that. So after this webinar finishes, what I'd like you to do is just write down 3 things, just jot down a note now, that you can change straight away. They can be absolutely tiny. It can be putting your watch onto a different hand. It can be watching a television program, which is completely different to anything you would normally see. And just try and keep that practice up. Not only will you start to build pathways more quickly and more easily, but it will mean that you embrace change better and that you cope in a crisis. And that's the key and really important in terms of resilience. You know, we have one practitioner who works with us, Tina, and she is literally the goddess of adaptive behavior. She has built constant change into every single aspect of her life, and she talks about how much it's changed everything, her outlook, and even a lot of other people have said it as well, that it even makes you feel more awake and more alive. There's a really lovely quote by Paulo Coelho, who's one of my favorite writers. And he said, "We will only understand the miracle of life fully when we allow the unexpected to happen." And certainly building adaptive behavior into your life will allow you to do that. Of course, it hasn't really been allowing change to happen over the last few months. It's been sort of change hitting us wave after wave. And that's meant that resilience and being able to cope and to embrace that change has been even more important than before. So we have one premise that's absolutely central to all of our cognitive training, and it's this: our stress and disturbance does not depend on the situation or event, but on our response to the situation. So just have a moment to read that again. It doesn't depend on the situation itself, but the way we respond to the situation. That's what causes us the stress or allows us not to feel that stress. So we can determine the way that we respond. And we know that that's true by looking at something called the 100-person rule. So very simply, if you put 100 people into a room who'd just been divorced or just say been made redundant, we're actually working with several companies at the moment who are undergoing a process of redundancy, then no 2 people in that room will react in the same way. You'll have every reaction from somebody for whom it is absolutely the end of the world through to somebody who has wanted to start their own business, do something different with their life for ages, and this is the opportunity. And of course, everything in the middle. And whilst there will be different circumstances, it's much more about a different mindset. One of the ways that we can change this mindset, reframe a negative mindset, there's lots of ways, but one of them is to use the method of changing demands, swapping demands to preferences. So we all place a lot of heavy demands upon ourselves and actually on the world around us and on other people sometimes too. And if we can swap them in for preferences, we take a lot of the stress off ourselves and our brain gets used to reframing the negative. It gets practiced at doing that. So the language of demand is must, have to, should. Format of a preference would be I would prefer that ... but ... So if we were going to reframe a demand, it might be to go from saying I must be better at handling the current situation, or I should be better at handling the current situation. And we might reframe that to I would prefer to be better at handling the current situation, but I accept that I've had to deal with an awful lot of change and I'm actually learning to adapt. I'm coming on. So you can change as many demands as you can for preferences. Is brilliant. Just keep doing it. I used to do it at every available opportunity. I would prefer that the train was on time, but whatever it is, just let your brain get used to thinking in that way. And similarly, I would say, just as important, reducing the amount that you awfulize. So we all have a tendency to awfulize, or sometimes it's called catastrophize. In other words, to think that things are more awful than they are. Now, I absolutely know that there's an awful lot of genuinely serious situations that are happening at the moment, but there's an awful lot of trivial or more trivial situations that we're giving a lot more time and energy and focus to than we would need to. So often a lot of those more trivial things can seem a lot more important. So to give an example, we always say, how awful is it really on a scale of 1 to 10? So something like missing a meeting or losing your phone can seem like a 10. But if you set it against some of the life or death situations that we've seen even in this country since March, then it's probably a 2 or a 3. So it's just about changing your perception. Back to that word, perception. So what I suggest that you do after this is to write down any issue that you're troubled with at the moment, and then underneath it, write all the numbers from 1 to 10. And when you finish, give 10 different responses to that same situation, where 1, just a couple of sentences, is that it's almost okay. 1 is a really low level response through to a very high level response, 10 response, where it's almost the end of the world. So it is about bringing down the numbers, but more than that, it's about practicing having different responses to the same situation. And gradually you'll believe that you are in control of the way that you respond to any situation. So resilience is very much about reframing our perception of events, and it's very much about rational thinking. So the way our brain works, it will bring the level, if you like, of the lesser problems up to those that are more serious. You've probably experienced that yourself. So it's thinking about, okay, which are the problems that I really need to be dealing with? And then how can I approach them rationally? And that means not allowing the ants to take over. Don't allow yourself to deal with the situation rationally. Don't let the ants steal your brain. Don't go down the spiral of one automatic thought leading to the next, leading to the next. And just as important as our thoughts, obviously, our emotions. And definitely, if you want to develop psychological resilience, one of the things that we need to do is to enhance emotional intelligence. So that's being aware of our own emotions and how we can manage them. It's also being aware of the emotions of other people, much more difficult on Zoom or online. Totally understand that. But as aware as you can of other people's emotions, and then responding to them in a way that is good for both your well-being and theirs. Really important. So what we're talking about to a very large extent is empathy. And if you really can, walk in someone else's shoes, see the situation or the world through their eyes, then suddenly a lot more options for any kind of problem solving are on the table. Really important. And increased empathy also reduces the amount that we judge. And that is at the root of an awful lot of stress. So that's really important. So moving now on to the third section of this webinar, which is resilience for performance. Resilience for performance, or personal effectiveness, as we call it within the Mind Fitness program. So getting and maintaining a positive mindset is absolutely key to resilience. And that's because if we're going to achieve anything, we absolutely have to believe that we can. So you may be familiar with the very old Henry Ford quote, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're probably right. Really interesting, isn't it? So I'd like you just to think for a moment, are you listening to your negative self-talk? And if you answered no, then I would ask you again, are you sure that you're not? Because very few of us don't. So identifying your limiting beliefs is really important if you want to progress your life and build your resilience. It really is so much about beliefs. Beliefs are everything. If you have the right beliefs, then you can find the right strategies and you can gain the right knowledge. If you don't have the right beliefs, then it's very likely that you won't even realize why life feels like such an uphill struggle. So resilience and performance are incredibly closely linked. You know, quite often when we ask people to think about that link, how closely they're linked or how they're linked, we'll get told that the deeper they thought about it, the closer the link became. And when we're talking about performance, just to be clear, so we're not talking about, you know, how many hours you're putting in. We're talking about results. So it's really thinking about how you're going from A to B. Are you going as quickly and as effectively as you can from A to B? And I would say if you turn it on its head, you know, it's very easy to see that if you're not resilient, then you definitely won't be going from A to B as quickly or as efficiently as you could be. You might actually not even be moving at all, because when we're not resilient, that's when we kid ourselves that the long hours are the same as the results, which they, of course, they absolutely aren't. So many of us have a huge amount of beliefs that are undermining our resilience. There's some beliefs that are actually quite common, and we're going to put a slide up to show some of those, and some that are just going to be individual to you. So what I'd like you to do as this slide goes through is just to read those. I'm not going to read them out, but just to read them through and to think for a moment about whether or not they apply to you. So just go through a few of those. I'm sure for most of you, there'll be at least one or two that you can absolutely relate to. But the really brilliant thing is that it doesn't have to be like that. It can change. Neuroplasticity means not only that we can change the way we think, but we can change what we believe. And it's really important to recognize that those limiting beliefs are likely to be defining how we set our goals, even the size of our goals and our aspirations. You know, what you build today will either empower or restrict you tomorrow. So it's really important that you learn to reframe the negative thinking, really important, but just as important that you learn to identify the positive beliefs that you have and let them power your journey, your continued commitment to change. We all have hundreds, literally hundreds of positive beliefs that probably are buried somewhere and we're not using them nearly as well as we could. And it's really important that we learn to do so. You know, we can we can choose to focus on the more helpful, positive beliefs, either new ones or old ones. And that doesn't mean pretending that things are better than they are. What it means is choosing, rather than to focus on the negative beliefs that we have, choosing to focus on the positive ones, choosing to focus on the aspects of our life that are more positive. And, I would say mindfulness is a brilliant way of gaining that kind of clarity and focus. A lot of organizations that we work with doing mindfulness, in fact, do it to help to build concentration and focus. And once you allow that change to happen, then it has a sort of deeper impact into the way that you see the world. To a very large extent, it's only our focus on anything that makes it extraordinary. Suddenly, once you're using that much tighter focus, everything becomes, more. So the way that our brain works is whatever we focus on, the senses. So if we look at blue through the whole of a day, it will become bluer as we go through. Our senses are heightened on whatever we focus on, and that really does change the way we see the world and other people, ourselves, everything. So I'm going to close the performance bit by looking at persistence, because that's obviously a really key part of resilience. So persistence is about achieving those goals, of getting to the B, of carrying on, perhaps when others wouldn't, in order to get to the B. There's a lovely saying that says that all you need to get somewhere is a map or a plan. I would say you also need two other things. You need techniques to stop you self-sabotaging, and you need persistence. You need to be able to carry on until you've achieved that goal. So it's partly about setting good goals. Always remember not to set goals that are unattainable. They must be a challenge, but they shouldn't be unattainable. That's one of the most stressful things that we can do. So set challenging but attainable goals. And then persistence is about two things. It's about believing in that goal, and it's about believing in yourself. In other words, it's believing that you can do it and believing that it's worth it. And believing that that goal is worth it is so important. So when I'm coaching sometimes and people are adopting a new mindset, or perhaps they're starting a new enterprise, I will quite often say to them, okay, what would you have to believe to persevere with this for 2 years? And they tell me, and I say, brilliant. Okay, believe that now, and then you probably won't have to persevere for 2 years. But it's a great way of thinking about the situation and how much you really do value what it is that you're heading towards. Future mapping is one technique that we use, where we will get people to visualize their future self, visualize the self that has achieved that goal. And again, it isn't about wishful thinking, it's just about deepening the understanding of what that would look like and what it would take for you to get to it. And then it's about the self-belief. So as we've said, having a robust self-image is absolutely key to resilience. So in Mind Fitness, we don't talk about self-esteem, we talk about self-image or self-value, because esteem is to estimate, and that makes it both relative to other people and conditional. Conditional on the job that you have, the car in your drive, the money you earn, and that makes you incredibly vulnerable. If your sense of self-worth depends on your job and then you don't have it anymore, then suddenly everything is taken away from you. So we instead encourage people towards unconditional self-acceptance. And I would say that moving away from the relative is especially important in these times of sort of social media. What we see on social media is the success stories. We don't see how many failures there have been before they got to the success. In other words, we rarely see the story behind the story, and it's absolutely worth remembering that. I would definitely say that resistant people are people who are not frightened to fail. Definitely people that are resilient and persistent will learn from their mistakes, really important, but they'll lean into their successes. They'll dwell on their successes. And it's something that we're just not good at in our society. You know, we very rarely pin our successes, celebrate them, think about our achievements. And it's such an important part of persistence and motivation. There's a brilliant quote actually from Tony Robbins, who's I'm sure everyone will know, but a massively brilliant motivational speaker. And he says, it's easy to feel like a loser when you aren't keeping score, which is great, isn't it? It's really important that you pin every achievement that you possibly can. And when those successes come, it's important that you believe that you deserve it. If you don't believe that you deserve it, then it's very likely that the self-sabotage will step in. It's why often, you know, things that are won are very quickly lost afterwards. So what can you do to believe that you deserve it? I would say that it's always about giving the very best value that you can. So making sure that your customers have total satisfaction. Do the same for your colleagues and your staff, maybe even your friends. And I would definitely say make sure that you follow through on commitments and promises, because that's one of the easiest ways for your self-value, your self-image to take a dive. Moving then into the conclusion. So it's important that we keep as resilient and as positive as we can be for as much of the time as we can. Now, I know that that's not going to be all the time, but for as much of the time as we can, because obviously, you know, the moment when we're creating the future is now. You know, the time we're spending in the present is the time that we are spending with our life. One leads directly to the other. From a neuroscience perspective, it's also worth remembering that resilience is never a constant. Some days you'll be more resilient than others. It's really good if you can learn to identify that and make sure you use those times when you're resilient to tackle the hard stuff. Similarly, for most people, not everybody, but for most people, resilience and willpower diminish through the day. So again, try and tackle the things that are going to need the most near the beginning of the day, if you possibly can. And our resilience is often undermined by our past experiences. But again, that doesn't have to be the case. So what we can do is to instead use our experiences, even the difficult ones, especially the difficult ones, to build our journey from A to B. Use them to build our journey forwards, because from the brain's perspective, from the time that you do that, it stops them being obstacles. They'll stop you tripping you up, which is brilliant. And remembering that negative self-talk that we mentioned at the beginning is part of the human condition, but you don't have to listen to it. Just because you think something doesn't mean to say you have to believe it, let alone act upon it. And finally, I would say, give the time to commit to any process of change. You know, so with our book, Unlock You, the last chapter is actually a 6-week program, but the 6-week program is only working 10 minutes, 10 designated minutes a day. You know, if you don't have the book, or you could use some of the exercises from Tembo, or you could just do 5 minutes of reframing and 5 minutes of mindfulness to get your 10 minutes a day. Obviously it works because you're with your wonderful brain 24/7. That's how you can afford to only do 10 minutes designated a day. But it's shown in all the studies that if you start any program of change straight away, you've got a much better chance of success. So I'm going to show the slide of all of our contacts, and then I'll head into, I'll have a look at the chat and see if there's any questions there. So I know sometimes people leave questions that are just can be seen by me and sometimes seen by everybody. I'll answer the ones that don't ask for me to answer them privately. So on this contact sheet at the top, you have Use Tembo, and that is the app that I was speaking about. So you don't go in via the App Store, you just sign in on your browser. You just type in usetembo.app and then you sign in. And from then on, it works like any kind of app. And as I said, there's, the next iteration of it comes on board in mid-November. So it goes up in stages. But even at the moment, there's hundreds of exercises that you can use. So please do sign on. Our website is underneath that. Again, on the website, if you go into Unlock You and then resources, there's lots of free resources on the website. On our Facebook, we do free resources and lots of helpful tips, and we post articles from other people. And then on the left there, there's my email. So please do feel free to email me privately if you have anything that you would prefer that I answer that way. So I'm going to have a look now at the chat, which says, I'm wondering, okay, so someone has asked if the practice of changing 3 things should be kept up on a regular basis. Yes, absolutely. So we always say, try and change no more than 3 things at a time, even if it's looking at 3, problems. Once you've gone past the 3, it tends to get a little bit dissipated. But yes, change 3 things absolutely straight away. And in terms of adopting adaptive behavior, yes, keep changing them. Maybe every, so you've written here 3 things every week. Yeah, that would be great. But as soon as you feel that it's, you're used to the last one, move on to the next one. And I would say that gets faster and faster. So Tina, who is the queen of adaptive behavior, literally could change 3 things a day now. That would work for her. And can I just say, actually, it's not written here, but I'd like to just say this. I know it's not completely linked to resilience, but the other really brilliant thing about adaptive behavior, at the moment, it's about the best form of dementia prevention that we have. So when we get dementia, the decay that happens will continue to happen. But if we practice adaptive behavior, we have cognitive reserve, which means that we can bring in new pathways to replace the ones that are decaying. So until they find a way of stopping that decay, it's about the best form of dementia prevention that we have. So constantly new thinking, building new neural pathways is really critical. I don't know why it's not pushed more, but obviously it has to be new thinking. So a crossword puzzle or a Sudoku where you're retrieving old information wouldn't cut it. It's always doing or thinking something new. Okay, there's another question there. Could I ask you to repeat what you said? What you build with, okay, right. I said what you build today either empowers or restricts you tomorrow. So, if you're building a bigger, a lot of this is obviously related to having a growth mindset. If you're expanding your belief system, if you're getting rid of your limited beliefs, then that will empower you tomorrow. Or the opposite is true. We don't operate, human beings don't operate on a standstill basis. We're either going in one direction or another. And, it's really important that we're always moving in the right direction. And then I've got just one question that's been asked, which is, okay, so you're asking me, it is asked just to me, but it doesn't say to answer it privately. I think it's a perfectly okay one to answer. So it says that some people lose resilience and willpower through the day. Is it possible to do the opposite? Yes, absolutely. So, we get up in the morning. I would definitely say that doing part of the practice very quickly in the morning is actually a great thing. But if you get up in the morning and something happens and you're not feeling great, you can definitely boost your resilience by doing any of the exercises, reframing your perception about things, just reducing the amount we awfulize, just, I use gratitude a lot. So, for example, if we're thinking about perception, so many of us get really grumpy about queuing, but we'd all be really glad to queue for a food drop if we were in a war zone. And actually, we were even fine queuing for the toilet rolls in the second or third week of lockdown. So it's just about reframing our perception. And I would also say about boosting the self-image. So probably no better way of doing that than to do things for other people. So on a Friday, I run something called Friday Club, which is for adults with disabilities and mental ill health. And all of the practitioners at the end of the day always feel better than they did at the beginning of the day, partly because every person that comes is truly wonderful, and partly because just that thing of helping other people, making a difference, releases lots of dopamine and other good happiness chemicals, but also builds your resilience. So when I come home after Friday Club, even if I'm tired, I try and tackle then the things that I know that I'm going to need a fair chunk of resilience for. And I've got another one here which says, and it's to everybody, I struggle to keep changing behaviour as my partner says what I need to do is to create habits for security. To create habits for security. So I would say it's a mixture of the two. You can use adaptive behaviour by changing very small things. If you're feeling a lack of security, then it's definitely not a good idea to change everything at once. So that's why, I've said definitely, try and keep to changing 3 things. But it's a long-term plan, essentially. Long-term, I mean matter of weeks, not months or years, because we cling on to something for security and we think that that will make us feel better and be able to cope. Whereas actually it's by embracing change that we are more able to cope. But there's that little period in the middle where we might feel, even if you do something like give up smoking, a lot of people feel very restless, don't feel like, I know when I did, which is 20 something years ago, but you don't feel like yourself. You feel very restless for a little while and it feels like you need to hang on to things for security. But actually, the more you can get used to embracing change, the less you will feel that need to hold on to the things for security. But as I said, don't let everything go at once. And, if there are habits that will help you by building positive habits, like I said, to have one mindfulness exercise that becomes your go-to exercise, then, allow that to be a positive part of your life. So I hope that answers the question. Don't think I've got any more questions there. That one, I'm just going to say one more thing about. So, it says that the partner doesn't like the change, and and I definitely think that that's one of the things that's always hardest, isn't it, in relationships, is to accommodate change, both for you and for the other person. But if the more you can keep it open and communicate about it, the better. So we often think that using mindfulness, building resilience is about an internal growth that's it's just for us, whereas actually if we're more able to cope ourselves, we're an awful lot more able to be empathetic. we're a lot more able to appreciate another person. We're more able to communicate without taking things personally. So there's a very definite positive effect to all of the important relationships that we have. So it's worth working together, if you can, to build in that resilience and that ability to embrace change. Okay, so I think I've answered all the questions now. So please do stay in touch with us at Mind Fitness. We're not about delivering a webinar and then disappearing. We're very much about building a community. So please do, you go onto the social media. Please do look at Tembo. I'm absolutely sure that you'll find things there that are able to help, and just spread the word. The more that we can support each other through this next few months, we're going to need it, the better. So thank you ever so much, and I hope you come to the next one. Bye.